Good evening, everyone from Doha, and good afternoon for those joining us from US or Europe. I'm Sinem Cengiz, a non-resident fellow with Gulf International Forum and a researcher with Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. We are today excited to welcome you all to this timely, important discussion on the upcoming elections in Kuwait, scheduled for June 6. Several countries around the world have been going through critical elections in the past 2 months, including my homeland in Turkey, and now elections in Kuwait, a country that I was born and raised. So Kuwait is to hold the parliamentary elections on June 6, and it is the most recent development in an ongoing constitutional crisis that has shaken the country and exposed deep rifts between the executive and the legislative branches. The upcoming elections could offer the country a way to diffuse the crisis or could simply extend Kuwait's political deadlock. So this is the main question that we will try to explore today. So just to give a brief background about what's happening, the current political crisis actually dates back to 2020 when the newly elected parliament clashed with the executive branch through parliamentary questioning and media attacks. The parliament's inability to resolve those disagreements led the Emir to dissolve the parliament in mid-2022, and Kuwaitis then went back to polls again, and it was in autumn last year, giving the opposition an even greater share of seats. So, however, in a very surprising move, Kuwait's Constitutional Court issued a decision scrapping the existing parliament and returning the one elected in December 2020, while dissolving the last year's royal decree. So within a month of the court's decision, the Crown Prince again dissolved the parliament, resorted with the court decision, and called for new elections, which prompt further unrest. So this is the general background now that the Kuwait has chosen to move to yet another round of elections. So what can be expected from the new polls? What are the reasons for the current political crisis in the country? What are the constitutional gaps to the current prolonged crisis, and how has it affected the country's democracy? How can the legislative and the executive branches overcome those challenges? Because the progress in countries' economic and political issues highly depends on a healthy cooperation between the parliament and the government. So we have also the factions within the parliament. Here, I mean the reformists, Islamists, and tribal groups. How will they perform in the upcoming elections, and what role will female candidates play, actually? So most importantly, the general discussion will be around, will the opposition have the chances to perform as in the previous elections, and what are the main challenges of this political system itself? So in order to answer these questions, we have a perfect line of esteemed speakers who first comes to mind when the elections in Kuwait happens. So we have Dr. Mohammad Alrumaihi, Dr. Courtney, and Dr. Daniel Tavana. Our speakers will bring their insights about the elections. We will first have their speeches and then a Q&A session. So I will have a couple of questions to our speakers, but of course, if you have any questions over the discussion, please let us know through the YouTube chat, and so we will be able to go through your questions in the meantime. I will now try to introduce our speakers in order of their speaking. We will first start with Dr. Mohammad Alrumaihi. He is a professor of sociology in Kuwait University and member of the board of directors at Gulf International Forum. Previously, he served as a member of the advisory board for Council of Ministers headed by Kuwait Prime Minister. He is a member of the board of Diplomatic Institute in Kuwait Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He is also affiliated with Doha Institute for Graduate Studies and Baptain Cultural Foundation. He has written extensively on political sociology and social change in the Gulf region. Dr. Alrumaihi is the founder and editor-in-chief for several daily and monthly publications and advisor on cultural, social, and political issues for the Kuwaiti government and private institutions in the Gulf region. I have earned a great deal of knowledge from his approach to the Gulf studies, and I'm happy to have him today with us today. So second, we have Dr. Daniel Tavana. He is an assistant professor at Department of Political Science at Penn State. Dr. Tavana's research interests include a focus on elections, identity, and comparative political behavior, as well as the dynamics of the political opposition in authoritarian regimes. He studies these issues in the Middle East and North Africa, where he uses a variety of methods and data to study electoral politics. He receives his PhD from Princeton University in September 2021. I had a chance to listen to his work in a conference held in Kuwait in 2019. And today he's joining us from Kuwait, actually, on the ground. He will try to brief us on what's going on. So we are certainly very curious to hear. And last but certainly not the least, Dr. Courtney Freer. She is a non-resident senior fellow at Gulf International Forum and postdoctoral fellow at Emir University. Previously, she was a research officer for the Kuwait program at the LSE Middle East Center. Her work focuses on domestic politics of the Gulf states, particularly the roles played by Islamism and tribalism. Her book, Rentier Islamism, The Influence of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Gulf Monarchies, based on her dissertation, was published by Oxford University Press. She sheds light on the sociopolitical role played by the Muslim Brotherhood groups in Kuwait, Qatar, and UAE, and definitely she will let us know a lot about the tribal groups, women, and the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. She previously worked, by the way, in Brookings Doha Center and US Saudi Arabian Business Council. She holds a BA from Princeton University, MA from George Washington University, and I have learned a lot from her, and she's contributing to our book on Kuwait currently, so I'm very happy to have her too. So without further ado, we will start first with Dr. Alrumaihi. Professor, the floor is yours.
I'm sorry, I lost for a minute or two. Hello, are you hearing me?
Yes, we are hearing
Good.
you.
I'm sorry, I have lost the pictures. Well, as you may know, that I have written on this subject, a number of articles and extensive articles. And to make probably a long story short, I do recognize at least 5 obstacles of the development of Kuwaiti democracy. For the long time, we have been talking about those obstacles, probably 30, 40 years ago, and nothing has happened to solve them. It is up and down experiment, and it's election and non-election periods. Unfortunately, nothing has been produced. I have my reservation on calling what we are doing here in Kuwait a democracy. It is rather than it's short than democracy which we have known in the West or in some other countries. Anyway, I have at least 5 major points to offer them for our friends here in the panel and for those who are following us. First of all, the rigidity of our constitution. There is no country in the world which have a written constitution unless they have done some sort of amendment. We have living with this constitution for the last 60 years, and we know that it should be amended because the circumstances have been changed from the founding father to the grandsons of today. But unfortunately, this constitution is not have been touched, although there was some sort of try and error before, but the same constitution we are living with. The problem here is that there is a lot of defects in this constitution. Just to mention one only, those who have elected the 50 member of parliament in 63, the first election, now they are only probably 4% of the those who are eligible to vote. So the society have been troubled or more, and the number of the parliament is the same. And of course, there is another things. The constitution itself says that this constitution will not be touched before 5 years of implementing the constitution. Of course, the 5 years have elapsed, and nothing has been done to that. This is one major element. The second, the fight within the family, unfortunately. What we have in the Gulf, mostly and recently, that the succession of the ruler is from father to son. So this limit if you like, whatever it is, to compete between those people who are eligible to be rulers. Here in Kuwait, the constitution says that an eligible ruler is one of the sons or grandson of Mubarak al-Kabir. There are thousand of them now, and the cream of them, if you like, at least 50 or 60%, they compete between each other. And this competition need support, specifically from the member of parliament, and this support need money. So this is one of the problem we are facing, and it has been mentioned. I mean, this point has been mentioned regularly within the election campaign, and from a number of candidates. But I think it's very difficult to limit the competition in this area. So we will have this fighting within the family itself. Number three, there is no, in the words, there is no books for voting books for election unless there is a parties. The only one country which has an election books, if you like, and no parties is Kuwait. So member of parliament stand for their own and individually, and they could be either bribed, pushed around, or pressurized to take side here and there. So we have 50 member of parliament with 50 agenda, almost 50 agenda. Some of them, as everybody knows, Muslim oriented, either Sunni or Shia, and some of them tribal oriented, and of course others of financial houses. So that's why we are trying to push the idea of parties or some other of organization, and of course we failed. As we know, all the parties can select the candidate, and they can take him out if he goes out of the party line. Okay. The fourth, that's what we have are individual member of parliament, and those individuals, after a few months, they discover that if they can use their pressure, they can have some money from those influential people, or they can have, if you like, a way to put their people in higher position in the government. And that's why this reflects on the bureaucracy itself. So the bureaucracy here is who you are, who know, but not what you know. The fourth probably is the system itself, or the ruling family, or those people in power specifically. Either they don't want to reform the system, or they can't reform the system because of the pressure around us. I know I am approaching the 8 minutes now, and I leave it up to here. If I can give you some other thoughts, I'll be willing to do those. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Alrumaihi, for highlighting the few obstacles that you have mentioned about the Kuwaiti politics, that I have taken some notes about it: absence of parties, the style of bureaucracy, reform of the system, fight within the family, and the constitutional problems. We will definitely go through all of these questions. And now we will go ahead with Dr. Courtney. Your floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here. I was just in Kuwait a few weeks ago. Unfortunately, I couldn't stay for the election, so I'll be curious to hear from Dr. Tavana about that. But I'm happy to share some of my impressions from that trip and from kind of many years of being obsessed with Kuwaiti politics and parliamentary politics in particular. Overall, I would say, as many people have noted, these elections are being held under an atmosphere of general political malaise and frustration. When I've asked Kuwaiti friends about the situation back in April when the parliament was dissolved, many of them responded in terms of, to my question about what was going on in Kuwait, they called it carnival, quoting Abdullah Nafisi about kind of what disorder in the Kuwaiti political system. Many Kuwaitis I talked to when I was there are questioning the utility of participating in another set of elections only 6 months after the last ones. Others are questioning existing electoral rules, for instance, the single non-transferable vote system, which was imposed in 2012 through Emir decree. Others are also skeptical about whether any parliament can resolve gridlock between itself and the cabinet, which reflects some of the issues which Dr. Alrumaihi pointed out. This has also led to some discussions about electoral or other systemic reform, for instance, potentially the introduction of a quota for female candidates, the introduction of proportional representation are a few solutions that I've heard being posed. Overall, I mean, when it comes to seeing kind of what this election will yield, I imagine that the opposition, and I'll dig into what that term means in just a minute, I imagine the opposition will do well, as it did in September's elections. Indeed, the platforms of many candidates and blocs have not changed. But the opposition's success, in my view, is largely dependent on voter turnout, which could be depressed due to this disillusionment with the system, which I've mentioned, which Dr. Alrumaihi has mentioned, as well as the timing of the election in June when many people leave the country. When it comes to the number of candidates, as of mid-May, I read reports that there were around 252 candidates, among them 15 women, which is a lower number than those who had signed up for the September elections, which was 376 people, including 27 women, at least according to the figures that I saw. Regardless of whether these figures are still the same today, what has been confirmed by all sources is that there are fewer candidates in this election than the previous one. And we've also seen even Kuwaiti journalists urging people not to boycott the election because there has been this frustration with and questioning of the utility of this system if it continues in the way that it has been. And one politically active Kuwaiti asked me, he said, why would you want to run for parliament? Or why would you, if you ran a political bloc, want to run more candidates? His point being that it's difficult to pass legislation given the gridlock between parliament and cabinet. And when things fail to go through, parliament tends to be blamed. And so it's not the most attractive prospect for people to try to join it. And this is not something necessarily new. This is something that I've been hearing a lot in recent months. In essence, this reflects the balance of power in Kuwait, that parliament has enough power and enough authority to disrupt the system, but not enough effectively to change the order. The last elections did represent, and as I mentioned, a victory for opposition candidates. They won 28 out of 50 seats, many of them from tribal groups, from Sunni Islamist groups as well. 27 new members also won seats, while about 24 MPs had lost their seats. So this suggested an overwhelming desire for change in the last election. And so it'll be interesting to see who of the incumbents from the last election are re-elected this time, and also what will happen in terms of this opposition balance of power. And I've mentioned that word opposition a lot, and I think it's worth bringing up that this term is not static when it comes to Kuwaiti politics. It has never been static. People, I think, especially in the Western press, like to use it as an explainer for saying, okay, over half of the parliament is oppositional. That doesn't necessarily mean they're united in any one reformist agenda. It also doesn't necessarily mean that the same candidates are oppositional from election to election. Just to give a quick example, Marzouk Al-Ghanem, who was the Speaker of Parliament in 2020 and is largely seen as loyalist, made a speech, made a few speeches in April, one in which he decried the state of the country and placed some blame for the situation on the prime minister, who's a member of the ruling family. This doesn't really seem like the behavior of someone who is a loyalist. So just to give you a sense of that these categories are somewhat slippery. They're not necessarily static. When it comes to Islamist candidates specifically, there are several groups to consider. So in the last election, Sunni Islamists took 8 seats, but not from one single bloc. The most organized bloc is Hadas, which is the Arabic acronym for the Islamic Constitutional Movement, or the ICM, which is the Muslim Brotherhood's branch in Kuwait. Hadas has chosen to run 3 candidates. This is consistent with the number they've tended to run. They had won 3 seats in the last election. And so that seems pretty consistent. One change that we've seen in recent years, I would say, is the rise of independent Islamist candidates, both those who are seen as more aligned with the Muslim Brotherhood but are not running under the Hadas banner, as well as Salafis who have become increasingly segmented. So this could be potentially a result of the lack of a political parties law, that we see more independents. It also could be the result of the SNTV, or single non-transferable vote system. We can talk about that more in a moment. Moving on to kind of Shia candidates, whether Shia Islamist or other candidates, in the last election, Shia candidates won 9 out of the 50 seats. Conventional wisdom states that Kuwait's Shia blocs, which are often referred to as Islamist, are actually more pragmatic than traditionally Islamist, in that they focus less on social policy issues than on preserving their relationship with the ruling elite. Again, this is the kind of conventional wisdom. It's not to say that this is always true, or that this is true for every Shia candidate. But it is worth noting that, for instance, when an opposition boycott was put in place between 2012 and 2016, after the imposition of the SNTV system, Shia blocs made substantial gains. And so we could see potentially some gains for Shia political blocs or Shia candidates if members of the opposition do end up boycotting the polls. As far as performance of female candidates, 2 women, Jinan al-Bushahri in the 3rd district and Ali al-Khalid in the 2nd district, were elected in the last poll in September, after no female candidate was successful in the 2020 election. We believe that so far, as I mentioned before, there are fewer female candidates, and so that obviously decreases the possibility of them being voted in. Both of the 2 female incumbents are running, and many in Kuwait seem very confident that Jinan al-Bushahri will win her seat once again in the 3rd district. Her performance in parliament, particularly her role in interpolating the Minister of State for Cabinet Affairs, was seen was popularly received. So she is seen as a likely winner in this upcoming election. The 2nd district may be more difficult for Ali al-Khalid, but it's still uncertain. And we do see groups like Madawi's List and the Women's Cultural and Social Society helping female candidates, especially given some of the structural, some of the challenges that women face running for office in Kuwait. One thing that's worth pointing out is that there are many political blocs which are very unlikely ever to run female candidates. So Salafi and Muslim Brotherhood groups are not super likely to run female candidates. Large tribal groups from the outlying 4th and 5th districts also are unlikely to run female candidates. And so we see it's a very small pool from which these candidates are derived, and they tend to come from the interior, from the city, and among political blocs which have more liberal views when it comes to the role of women in public life. I guess I will end there on this note, really of kind of things are still up in the air. Overall, there is this sense of disillusionment with the system, distrust of the system potentially. But I would caution us against seeing that as something that's entirely new or different from what we've seen in Kuwait in the past, given that this system has been in place for quite some time, as Dr. Alrumaihi pointed out. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Courtney, for bringing here and sharing your firsthand observations from your previous trip. And you generally say that opposition will do well, and the word opposition is not static when it comes to Kuwait. We have to delve into that more, maybe, because there are several different agendas of these groups. And you have mentioned some diverse groups within the opposition, but we need to go also through their agendas, what they really seek for in the second round. Now we will go ahead with Dr. Daniel. So how's the climate in Kuwait, but not in terms of weather, but the election climate? Let us know more about that. So floor is yours.
Thank you all so much, and thank you to GIF, Sinem, and the other panelists. I'm going to try and share a couple general observations from things I've learned on the campaign and being here in Kuwait. And I'm going to try and keep my comments to three kind of general points that build off and in ways I think work with what the other panelists before me have said. First, I think that Kuwait is in the middle of a constitutional and governance crisis. And I think the root of this crisis is really the government's refusal to govern and some of the questionable constitutional decisions it's made over the past couple years. Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this crisis and some of these challenges that have come with it have become a kind of salient campaign issue and what that looks like in Kuwait now and what's similar and what's different from the past. And then I'll close by talking about a couple electoral dynamics without trying to overlap much what Courtney said. By and large, I think that this is going to be a repeat of the 2022 election with maybe a few surprises. So first, I think we have a nice overview of I think the kind of framework of the crisis beginning with the 2020 elections. And I think it's important to note that the government's really the crisis that exists in Kuwait today is a product of the government's refusal to govern, and again some of the questionable constitutional decisions that it's made. And as Courtney mentioned, the crisis has contributed to widespread feelings of frustration, right? But these also aren't necessarily new to Kuwaiti politics. Just to kind of give a quick overview, the Constitution provides the National Assembly with broad lawmaking and legislative powers, as Dr. Alrumaihi mentioned, in addition to mechanisms that allow it to investigate and sanction abuses of executive authority. Despite that, it still privileges the executive branch in many ways. The executive branch, the government appointed by the Emir through the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, are appointed and can propose draft laws. And there are typically, but not always, about 16 of those ministers. So in order to actually govern the country, all the government effectively needs is 18 out of 50 or 36% of directly elected MPs. Despite these advantages, its legislative powers, it has struggled to keep a cabinet in place for more than a year, and it hasn't passed any serious legislation in this period either. In fact, it has abstained from attending sessions at many times without due cause. So this is sort of the background, I think, to the current crisis. And this is where the roots, I think, lie. About a year ago, the Crown Prince gave a speech televised that was received generally pretty well to Kuwait, committing the government to a series of reforms. Although these reforms haven't really been implemented, the government, as a key kind of component of this reform, temporarily refrained from interfering in the National Assembly's selection of a speaker, which has historically happened at the beginning of every session. From summer of 2013 to summer of 2021, for about 8 years, this speaker has been Marzouk Al-Ghanem. And for the most part, Marzouk has done the government's bidding in the legislature. He has won every election for the speakership in the past with the support of the government. He's often backed legislative maneuvers that, even if they were not unconstitutional, almost certainly violated the spirit of the Constitution in ways that have really over time degraded the parliament's capacity to effectively oversee the government and to call it out and monitor its abuses. Of course, over these past years, and especially more recently, there have been a number of scandals regarding the abuse of public money, corruption, and graft scandals. And the government and parliament's inability to rectify some of these abuses, coupled with Marzouk's increasingly authoritarian tendencies as speaker, facilitated a growing rise in his unpopularity. And I think over time, Marzouk became a liability for the government. He's a deeply unpopular and polarizing figure in Kuwait, despite the tremendous amount of power and influence he wields. And one thing that the Crown Prince mentioned in this televised speech was that the government would no longer participate in the election of the speaker. This was interpreted by many as a lack of confidence in his ability to manage legislative executive affairs. As a result, Marzouk refused to run in the 2022 elections, resulted in the speaker's election of Ahmed Sadoun, a longstanding nationalist figure who served as speaker in 1985, again from 92 to 99, and briefly in 2012. Sadoun's brief tenure as speaker from 2022 until now wasn't without controversy either, and maybe we can get into that in the Q&A. But that's sort of where we are at in the crisis, right? How has this become a salient campaign issue? Primarily because Marzouk is running again, and he's running not as an ally of the government, as Courtney mentioned. I wouldn't necessarily say he's opposition, but he's running in kind of opposition, certainly to the track record of the existing and young government led by the Prime Minister, Sheikh Ahmed al-Nawaf. So this is kind of almost exactly what happened in 2020, where Marzouk's popularity has become a salient campaign issue, right? And this brings me to my second point, which is how this has kind of become a campaign issue. Because of Marzouk's refusal to run in the last election, and now he's returned, in his return, he's branded himself as a fierce critic of the government. Specifically, as I mentioned, Ahmed Nawaf. He's indirectly criticized members of the ruling family in campaign speeches, calling the prime minister a danger to Kuwait, accusing his affiliates very directly of financing the campaigns of other candidates. On the campaign trail here, who would become the speaker and how people feel about Ahmed Nawaf's conflict with Marzouk al-Ghanem has become the hot button issue. Candidates talk about it almost all the time. It's on TV and social media constantly. Candidates are forced to take a position on not only who they will elect as speaker, but how they want their particular membership in parliament to deal with Marzouk directly. So this has kind of confused the public's perception of different candidate allegiances, because it's kind of unclear if this is going to last or become a permanent thing. But this is certainly the direction that it's headed in. To give one example, one candidate I spoke with who has been a fierce critic of Marzouk in the past told me that if Marzouk decides to oppose the government on day one, for example, by holding an istijwab or grilling of the prime minister, it's possible that even Marzouk's fiercest critics in previous elections would support him even if the government doesn't defend itself. And the government really hasn't defended itself because it hasn't really showed up over the past 2 years. So all of these kind of signs signal both apathy, frustration, and confusion amongst voters, especially since they just participated in elections about 9 months ago. I think to kind of close briefly on what these elections will look like, I think by and large, it'll be a repeat of the 2022 election with very few surprises. Some of the figures I've seen suggest turnout will be around 55%. Close enough to last fall, 63%. 47 of the previous 50 MPs are running again. And 2 of them have been replaced by consensus by another candidate. These 47 secured about half of all votes in the last election, right? And so I think there's a sense that the short-lived 2022 parliament, people's perception that these MPs didn't really have enough time will lead to many of them being reelected. But there are a few surprises. The Brotherhood has, Hadass, as Courtney mentioned, has a couple challengers in 2 districts. Some of the tribes have challengers. Some of the long-standing Shia political parties or political factions also have challengers within them. Some of this is unusual. I would say for some groups it's more unusual than in previous elections, but maybe we can talk about those in the Q&A. So thanks again. Looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daniel. Well, we have several questions. Actually, I was planning to have a Q&A first, the first round of the questions that we have prepared, and then we have from our audiences several questions. So let's go then one by one. Let's start with Professor Alrumaihi. A question first from our side. To what extent and ways do you think the deadlock in Kuwait's parliamentary politics affects the economic diversification process in the country? And the second thing, would amending the constitution to allow the establishment of political parties limit the power of the ruling family in Kuwait? Because you touched upon the ruling family, maybe you could go in deep whether this kind of a change could limit their power. First, let's go with you, Dr. Alrumaihi, and then we'll go ahead with our speakers.
Okay, I'll start with the second question. I think if we have political parties like all other democratic societies, we will have at least more organized politics in our country, i.e. That the Prime Minister will deal with 2 or 3 or 5 political parties. He can make a deal with them and then go forward if possible. Political parties will make sure that whoever stands for election, that people will look after what he is doing, and then they will decide if he can continue or not. So political parties has a great number of advantages, but I don't think the establishment will allow this kind of practice, because this definitely will, if you like, lower their attitude vis-a-vis the general politics. This is one. The second, I think, from my observation, from what I have seen and discussed with people, there is a lot of problems suffered by the if you like silent majority. It is not those people in the media, it's not people who are on television, but generally speaking, we have at least 5 important issues. Let me just say them very quickly. First of all, the high rate of crime. We are witnessing in Kuwait a high rate of crime. We haven't seen it before. Drug pushers. We have seen this as well. And just recently, yesterday, there was a fight in those people in the prison dealing with the drugs with other officers. Probably the fourth, the fourth is family nepotism. Family nepotism goes up high, even selecting the minister themselves. I can point to you now, if you like, who is related to whom in this government. Probably 5, the bureaucracy. We have airy-handed, bureaucracy. So the private sector is complaining all the way through of this bureaucracy, and they're comparing what's going on with what's happening now in Saudi Arabia and some other places in the Gulf. So I'm a bit pessimistic, if you like. I don't think we will have, even if we elected some angels this time, I don't think the government will change the habit of choosing the ministers. from my experience, most of the ministers don't cooperate with each other. They take a decision and they go back to their ministry and take another decision. It's obvious. I can give you a lot of examples. So that's why I think, in short, you couldn't solve, the new problem with the old ways of solving things. We lack, if you like, the will to reform our system, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Alrumaihi. Courtney, so we will have 3 different questions on your area of expertise. One is about tribal primaries, one is about the women, and one is about the Shias. So tribal groups in Kuwait have traditionally been pro-establishment. However, do you think the recent crackdowns on tribal primaries did shift the support to opposition blocs? And regarding women participation, do you think the one-vote system is the main hurdle for women elections in the parliament? Regarding the Shia, will the ongoing crisis, if it continues after the elections, affect the relationship between Shia groupings and the state? Could the current institutional dysfunction foster more overt Shia opposition to the government? Please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, I was writing down your questions to make sure I at least attempt to respond to them. Great questions. On the first point about tribal groups, certainly we did see in the 2020 election a lot of attention paid to tribal primaries and crackdown on them. Tribal primaries have been held since the 70s. They have technically been illegal since that time, but we've seen the government kind of enforcing the crackdowns on them kind of unevenly. So we saw more crackdowns on them in 2008 in the 2020 election. In fact, 2 of the MPs who won from tribal groups in the last election did so from prison because they had been put there due to the violations of being involved in tribal primaries. I would say, though, that the move of tribes to opposition occurred kind of earlier on than now. I would say it's dated back potentially to the early 2000s. We saw in 2012 a lot of members of the tribal segment of the population being involved in protests which were demanding greater popular participation in government. Farah Naqib has also documented ways in which the relative deprivation of certain of the outlying areas in Kuwait has potentially spurred them towards more opposition movement. And I would say that has happened probably, I would date it maybe from the 90s, early 2000s, rather than a more recent switch. But we have certainly seen, and again, this shows the way that all of these labels are really moving targets, that initially tribes were seen as loyalist. And so that was what led to the naturalization of spurred naturalization of certain members of certain tribes in the 70s to kind of balance out, or 60s and 70s to balance out Arab nationalist opposition from the city. This is somewhat switched in that now we have a lot of opposition from tribes in outlying districts and more loyalist groups coming from the city. That's, of course, a very simplified answer. It's more complicated than that, but just the tribal groups have moved to the opposition, I would say, for the most part. But that doesn't mean every candidate from tribes is a member of the opposition. In any case, we have seen participation of some of the large tribes in certain protest movements. When it comes to the one vote system and how that affects women, I would say that's by no means the only hurdle, because women had trouble getting into parliament even before 2012, though we did see a record number of women in parliament in the 2009 election, but still low numbers in terms of women being voted in. I would say one of the hurdles is the fact that only certain political blocs will run women. As I mentioned, I think that's one hurdle. Another hurdle is certainly the single vote, the SNTV system, and potentially if that were removed, we could see more women being voted in. But even before that system was in place, there were relatively low numbers of women being voted into parliament. In terms of whether this constitutional crisis will shift state relations with Shia groups, that was the last question, right? So I'm interested in kind of in these Shia groups more broadly in Kuwait, and in talking to some people, it seems that potentially there could be a generational shift. And this is not just to do with necessarily with Shia political blocs, but potentially with other political blocs as well, that younger segments of some of these political blocs feel disillusioned, feel that they're not doing enough to represent their segment of the population, are not effecting change. I mean, legislation's not going through. And so there could be this kind of widespread disillusionment, not just with the government, but with the blocs as they exist. And so we could see more splintering into independent groups, independent candidates, and that could affect the relative cohesion of Shia political blocs, Sunni political blocs as well, and tribal blocs too.
Thank you so much, Courtney. So let's, in a speedy way, go to Dr. Daniel. We have a question for you. When comparing Kuwait to neighboring Gulf countries, is the existence of its semi-democratic system responsible for the slowdown of its economic diversification efforts, or is it the instability of its parliament? Is the constant instability of the National Assembly in Kuwait responsible for the low participation rate of the candidates in the current elections? How could this potentially impact the future elections?
Thanks for the question. I think this is an old kind of classical question in the study of Kuwaiti politics, and the narrative I think goes something like, well, if Kuwait didn't have a parliament, or if Kuwait didn't have the participatory politics that it does, then Kuwait would look like Dubai. And so I think I'm not a fan of these arguments. I think that it's very difficult to first of all, it's difficult to imagine that kind of counterfactual. Kuwait is a very different country from the Emirates, from Qatar, from Saudi, in lots of really important ways. It has a much longer, deeper history of participatory and parliamentary politics than any of those countries. It has stronger, more resilient institutions, right? Those institutions actually are around still today, despite the perseverance of many powers in Kuwait who have stopped really at nothing since independence to get rid of them, and still they can't. And so I think that those comparisons are misguided. One way, of course, to make that comparison is to say, okay, well, if Kuwait didn't have the parliament, it would look like Dubai. But there are many other countries that you could make that comparison to that look far worse than Dubai. And those are countries where traditions of parliamentary politics or traditions of civilian input into how the country is governed have broken down completely. And those examples, in many cases, lead to war, civil or ethnic conflict, or whatever. So I think if you're going to compare Kuwait to another country, or in an effort to kind of make that argument, you should compare it to all the countries, right, that don't have a parliament or don't have long traditions of participatory politics, not just the ones you like, in order to make your argument. And so that's sort of how I see it. It's not, I think, a very good comparison for a lot of different reasons. But of course, there are things we can learn from those examples in that comparison. But it's not perfect.
Thank you, Daniel. So, Dr. Alrumaihi, we have a question to you from Jassim Hussain, former member of Bahraini Parliament. He asks, can we say that the Kuwaiti parliamentary experience serves as a possible model for other GCC countries? Can the parliament offer help in making Kuwait realize its economic potential? Now, I think I asked the economic diversification and the potential in my questions to all of the speakers, because this is one of the dimensions that the audiences are curious about. So please, Doctor.
I think it makes a negative model, if you like, vis-a-vis the Gulf people. I know, and I appreciate if you like, the freedom of the Kuwaiti people. They can say whatever they like, either generally speaking and within limits, in social media or in writing. or in their diwaniyas. But this freedom goes around like this. You say whatever you like, we'll do whatever we like. So this is the combination, if you like. So whatever we say, whatever we write, whatever we ask for, there is no ear to hear this kind of problems. A number of answers will come to you. I have heard them myself from influential people. That okay, how about your salary? Are you traveling this summer or not? But people don't live on only this kind of privilege. They need freedom, yes, and they need reforms. As I told you, there is a lot of problems in Kuwait society, and even on the. I wonder if you are reading about Kuwait, but most of the people today in Kuwait, they are complaining of the roads. I mean, the roads in Kuwait is awful. One of I think a Gulf lady came to Kuwait, and she said, I want to go downtown, and I'm sorry to say this. This is what she said. I couldn't hold my chest. It's pumped out of my bra because of the pumping of the roads. So this is very simple sort of thing, and we have been for the last 20 years complaining about it, and nobody is taking the corruption is very high in Kuwait. It is well known. Even the corruption to judges. The other day, a number of them were arrested and taken to court. So this is because of the lack of internal, if you like, following up. So this kind of problems, I think, make people at the end of the day, they don't believe that much in what we call democracy. I have seen some studies in the United States saying if you have real development plan, people can compromise with their freedom. And I think this is what's happened to some of the Gulf states. If you have really a vision of general reforms. People here in Kuwait looking to the experiment in Saudi Arabia with an open eye, although the Saudis just a few years ago were almost a closed society. Now they are sending people to the up to sky. So unfortunately, I'm not saying that this is my point of view only, but I believe I do represent a widespread of the Kuwaiti people. They are comparing, for instance, how many days you can take your goods from Jebel Ali in Dubai, and how many days will take it from Shuwaykh port. There, a couple of days, here, a couple of weeks. So, I mean, this simple things. That's why we are all in a predicament. We need the freedom. We need the democracy. We love our constitution and country, but we need reform. And I think the reform, as I mentioned, probably this five or four obstacles when we started talking about the constitution is very rigid. The election laws is very negative, if you like, and of course people will stand on their own background, either Muslim brothers or Shia people or tribal background. The other day, one of the tribal candidates was saying, he was criticizing the prime minister. Do you know what was his general point? He said, this prime minister have 5 or 3 or 4 cabinet without one from our tribe. This is the democracy we are talking about in Kuwait.
Thank you, Dr. Alrumaihi. So, Courtney, they ask about, you mentioned about the districts. So, the opposition tends to be concentrated in the 4th and the 5th district. And what potential impact would the fact that over 40 candidates dropped from the election, a lot of which are from the 4th and the 5th district? So, do you think this they're dropping off from the election have any impact on the opposition's performance in the election? Do you think it will impact adversely? And the second question would be, in general, of course, you mentioned about the Shia opposition, but in general, if we would like to speak, what is the impact of the political impasse on sectarianism in Kuwait? Does it, for example, fuel anti-Shia sentiments as they are generally seen as siding with the government? In general, briefly, if you can mention.
Great. Yeah. On the first question, I mean, I had read about that there were fewer candidates from 4th and 5th districts. I don't think this will have a huge impact on opposition performance, largely because as Daniel mentioned, 47 of the previous MPs from the 2022 election are still running, and the majority of those are opposition. So I don't think this will necessarily adversely affect opposition performance. It may just be actually a way to strategize considering the SNTV system. And also, I mean, I did hear from many Kuwaitis, that they're questioning the utility of participating in the election. So it could have something to do with the idea that there's a question about whether it's useful to participate in if Parliament cannot in fact make the kinds of changes that it wants to make. In terms of the question about sectarianism, I think Kuwait is quite an exception in the region when it comes to this. I would say that, and anyone else can jump in as well on this, but in my experience, it seems that there's not really the sectarian divide that we've seen become so pernicious in places like, for instance, Iraq. I think what we've seen, especially you saw this in the aftermath of the attack on a Shia mosque in 2015 in Kuwait City, this focus on unity, focus on Kuwaiti nationalism, on Kuwaiti identity, rather than on division into various sects. And also it's worth noting that Shia politicians as do Sunni politicians, work with other groups. So they're not just kind of cloistered away from everyone else and separated. And I think that's something worth noting. And also Shia groups in Kuwait, Shia individuals in Kuwait have long been important members, many of them have long been important members of the merchant elite, and so have played an important part in Kuwaiti society, economy, and politics.
Thank you so much. We will have some, I think, questions about the merchant class as well. And Daniel, we have 2 questions for you. And the first is about, how do you think the prolonging of the current political crisis might impact the young Kuwaitis' interest in participatory politics and democracy? One of our audiences says and argues that there is no serious effort from the youth. Kuwaitis do not take the recent elections seriously. So what do you think? The second question goes to you again. Is it realistic to envisage some kind of a move by the new government to limit the legislative powers on matters such as parliamentary questioning? Because if the opposition remains the primary force in the National Assembly, how is this going to be sorted out?
Thank you. Yeah, I think there's my view on the first question is there's a lot of frustration with gridlock in the National Assembly. There's a lot of frustration with the carnival aspect of what happens in Parliament, as Courtney mentioned. And so you hear often Kuwaitis mention, like, kind of related to the previous question, oh, if we didn't have this Parliament, things would be better. But that being said, I think that the institution of the National Assembly is something the overwhelming majority of Kuwaitis are very proud of, not eager to give up, not willing to see kind of defanged in any real way. And so I think it's unlikely that there's public support for something like that. I think too that there's really no, despite conversations that the Emir and the Crown Prince may unconstitutionally dissolve Parliament in this way, I think that there's no real natural constituency that would support that kind of thing. So some of the groups we had mentioned, be it Shia voters, tribal voters, different tribes themselves as political organizations, political factions, I think all would be very vocally opposed to such a move. And so it's unclear that such a high risk decision would materialize. I mean, of course, it's possible, but I think it would lead to even more political uncertainty and conflict that exists today. And I think most people in Kuwait, most serious analysts of Kuwaiti politics or people who are engaged in politics in Kuwait kind of know that. On the youth, I think it's a really interesting question. I think many candidates are quite young. There are a lot of young candidates who run, who are successful, who've been able to leverage social media and other forms of new technologies to their advantage. When you go to campaigns, I mean, they're very lively. The few that I've been to, there've been many young people. I mean, there's a lot of diversity in general, but there are young people at these events. And so I think it's, there's certainly a frustration amongst some sectors that they feel they don't have anyone to represent them, and that their kind of youth interests as a group are not really taken seriously by the parliament. And I think that that's a real concern. But there are many young candidates too who are quite active and impressive. And so I think, there's this changing of the guard that happens every couple of elections. Some people stay around much longer than I think a lot of people would like. But there are a lot of new faces. I mean, there are 47 out of 50 MPs running again that ran in 2022. But many of those 2022 winners were first-time winners, younger candidates who represented youth interests in different ways across different constituencies. And so I think that's something to look out for in terms of the results.
So Daniel, before going to Dr. Alrumaihi, one last question for you so that we can finish the part with you. So in light of the recent pardoning of the Kuwaiti dissidents by the Emir in 2021, how might this gesture impact the upcoming parliamentary elections? And potentially, do you think it will affect the voting behavior of the voters and in light of the political identity issues in Kuwait? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it certainly had an impact on the 2022 election, where a lot of those who were pardoned were kind of testing the waters to see which candidates they would support. Faisal the Muslim in particular was very active in trying to support, I think, a couple candidates and others. But they're not really, they comment on the elections, they're active on social media. They're often very critical of the government and have been. But I would say that for in this election, at least compared to the last one, they haven't really been as active electorally. I think it's, the days of the boycott are kind of long over. Even the Democratic Forum, that the kind of historic liberal organization in Kuwait, they've boycotted since the one vote system. They're now fielding kind of two candidates in this election, one candidate in the previous election, sort of semi-unofficially. I wouldn't call it like a full-fledged endorsement. But, those days are kind of over, where there's a kind of need to kind of collect turnout from a bunch of different groups. At this point, those who want to participate are participating, and those who choose not to either do so for the reasons Dr. Alrumaihi described, frustration with the system, a feeling like it doesn't matter, feeling like it's a facade, right? Or they have other reasons for not wanting to participate that are related to those, but not so political.
Thank you, Daniel. Dr. Alrumaihi, a student, a PhD candidate from Gulf Studies Center of our program, asks you, do you think the Kuwaiti dilemma is due to the complexity of the political culture, or it's due to the lack of economic diversity? So I wanted to touch upon that point now. Will the elections, do you think, reconcile the rift between the merchant class, the ruling family, and the parliament? So the general deadlock is due to which one of them, you think? Thank you. You are muted, I think, Doctor.
I'm sorry if I understood the question. I think the lack of economic diversity, because we have a verbal headline, if you like, that we are going to diverse our economy, but no action is being taken. In fact, there is a good pressure on the private sector. Recently, have been the government was heavy-handed on them, and the laws and bylaws of doing business is very strict. You see, I want to go to the broader, if I may, issues. I think what we are using in the terminology, we have to take it with a little bit of a punch of salt, if I may. Because if you say opposition in Kuwait, I couldn't see any opposition. I mean, there was some sort of opposition of Arab nationalism by Dr. Khatib and Nebari and others. That was in the 70s, probably to the 80s. But now, most of those opposition is today, he opposed the government, and tomorrow he will be loyal. I can mention a number of names. Unfortunately, so opposition is not applied in this. Women participation, unfortunately, most of those candidates which have been elected before, they don't have the real vision of the role of women. They start by probably platform on womanism, but at the end of the day, they go for their own interest. A number of them we have elected, and we were very enthusiastic to them. Immediately, as soon as they get into parliament, they went to the government, and their performance in the government was, unfortunately, very, very bad. So, to sum up, I do. I have, an idea that this election will be, the participation in this election will be less than any other election. We have sometimes 50-60% of those eligible to vote. They go voting, but this time I believe the number will be low, and specifically the boycott will be from the new generation, because there are the frustration. I have seen them in universities and diwaniyas and some other groups. Yes, we have a good young candidate, but I think they most of them, they don't have the awareness of working together. Most of them, they have his own agenda, and he thinks he can solve by himself the problem facing Kuwait. What we are facing is acute. We are facing, of course, national security problems. We are facing, population problems. We are now only around 30% of the population. And of course, the economic diversity. As you know, now the prices of oil is going down, and the prices of commodity is going up. So our dinars is worth less than it was before 1 year ago. So this kind of general issue has not been addressed. The other issue I'm interested in is culture. We have been pioneers in culture, Arab and Gulf culture. We used to have music. We have to use theater. We have to use writers. We have to have great writers. All this and publication, all this have been diminished because of the pressure of the so-called traditional people. Probably our friend here in Kuwait, when they are in Kuwait, they know about this this document. If you want me to vote for you, you have to sign the document that there should not be co-education in the university. I mean, we are going back than what we were in the 60s and the 70s.
Thank you, Dr. Alrumaihi. Before the closing remarks, Courtney, one last question. You said the opposition is likely to perform good, and so will another opposition-led assembly inevitably lead to gridlock? You think is dissolution likely to repeat? Before the panel, we just said that, but let's hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always hesitant to predict things publicly, especially about Kuwait. But I mean, if I were to predict, I would say that I would think that the outcomes, as Daniel mentioned as well, the outcome of this election would be similar to that of September 2022, in that there would be an opposition majority. I mean, this doesn't necessarily mean that there will be gridlock, depending on composition of cabinet, the extent to which cabinet actually feels pressure to put through legislation and work with Parliament. So one doesn't necessarily lead to the other. But if I were a betting woman, I would probably bet that we would end up in a somewhat similar situation, unless there are some changes to electoral law, political party law, etc.
So we are approaching to the end. Maybe some closing remarks just for a minute. Dr. Daniel, maybe let's start with you for closing remarks.
Sure, I'll be brief. Just as it's been mentioned, I think the results are likely to look very similar to what we had last year. And I want to, kind of close by talking a little bit about this concept of opposition, which is fluid, and the question of whether or not there really is an opposition in Kuwait now, I think is an important question that there are many different answers to, and I tend to agree with Dr. Alrumaihi that it's hard to identify an opposition in this parliament, again, because the idea of opposition presumes government. So if there's an opposition, then there should be a government, and this government, since it came into power after the 2022 election, hasn't really governed. So it's hard to really say who's opposition and who's not if there's no government, if the government chooses not to actually govern the country, to pass laws, to pass reforms, to do the difficult job of leading the country, right? And so far, there's really not much of an indication that the government is very interested in doing that. And so I think that, yes, the results will be similar. Yes, the allegiances have kind of changed and moved in ways that probably will become clear after the speaker's election or otherwise. But I think that's, for there to be opposition and for the parliament to matter, the government has to show up. And right now it's really not.
So Daniel, let us keep us updated from the ground in this coming 1 week. So Dr. Alrumaihi, just a single minute in a very brief way. Can you just close up? Again muted, yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry. Well, I have put all my points on the table, as I mentioned before, and I think business will be as usual. Whoever doesn't like it, he can punch his face in the wall.
Okay, Courtney, anything else? Just the last minute?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had something more optimistic to say.
You were
But
perfect, actually.
yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is that, and Daniel made this point, is that I think I think all of us would agree that there's commitment to preserving the parliamentary model. And what's interesting is when people criticize it, they don't criticize, by and large, most Kuwaitis don't say we need to scrap parliament, but instead that we need to change the rules. We need, for instance, political parties law. We need to change the SNTV system. So there is a desire to work within this system to make it more effective. How that change actually happens, given the gridlock that we see now, is very unclear to me. But yeah, I mean, I assume we'll see somewhat similar results, and we may be back here sooner than later talking about another election, but we'll see.
Well, I think we should end up here because our time is up. I want to thank all our speakers. We are grateful for them to joining us on this very timely topic. And thank you for everyone who has joined us tonight. We are looking forward to Tuesday's elections in Kuwait. So take care. Ma'a salama.
Assalam.